Everybody, we're going to jump in on digestion now. The previous video covered the 4 primary tissue types in humans and did a brief overview of all the organ systems in the human body, the major organ systems. So we're going to dive into depth on 2 of those systems. The first is the digestive system, and the second will be the immune system, which we'll cover Saturday in class. So I want to dive right in, and where slides are pretty self-explanatory, I will leave those slides to you and try to minimize my commentary on them, because I know that videos can get long, although please break the material into smaller chunks as you review it, and keep in mind that a little bit of steady progress through the material on a day-to-day basis over the next week and a half or so is better than trying to gobble it all up in one take. So we are basically looking at the idea of organ systems, and in this case, the digestive system. So again, an organ system is a collection of body parts, organs, that are devoted to one general purpose. In this case, the purpose is to obtain nutrients and to use those nutrients in 2 possible ways. The first would be as building blocks, so structural nutrients, structural molecules to build muscle, to grow, to replace tissues that either through injury or through natural processes are worn down and need replacement, and also, of course, for energy. Ultimately, digestion is going to achieve its purpose in individual cells in cellular respiration, which we've talked about before. So there's 4 main processes involved. The first is ingestion, simply taking food in. Digestion is the process of breaking the food down, and we're going to see that there's 2 versions of that. One is physical breakdown, literally just breaking the food into smaller parts so it's more easily broken down chemically. And so mechanical or physical breakdown and chemical breakdown. And both forms of digestion are really important. Absorption, of course, is then taking the nutrients into the body and distributing those nutrients ultimately to every cell of the body. And finally, elimination, which is the process of getting rid of what is not useful or not needed. And so in the case of humans, that would be represented by some components in urine and by feces, of course. So those 4 main steps are helpful in terms of organizing your thinking around digestion. The primary organs we're going to see are listed here: esophagus, stomach, small intestines, large intestines, rectum, anus, and then the accessory organs: tongue, salivary glands, pancreas, liver, and gallbladder. The accessory organs are not part of the digestive tract. So the digestive tract can be thought of really as an elaborate tube that is sort of wound and folded into the body. And the accessory organs are organs that usually produce materials, substances to be secreted or released into the digestive tract to help with the process of digestion. But food doesn't actually pass through those organs. So we divide the main components of the digestive system into the digestive tract and the accessory organs listed and shown here. A couple quick comparisons. While we didn't go into the fungi in detail, it's worth noting that fungi are eukaryotes, so they're composed of complex eukaryotic cells. Evolutionarily, fungi are more closely related to animals than they are to plants. And fungi, like the mushroom shown here, the main part of the organism is actually invisible. You don't see most of a fungus. Most of a fungus is in the rotting wood, in the soil, in the cheese or bread or other food material in your kitchen, growing root-like in structures called hyphae. It's the reproductive portion of the organism that we begin to see as mold on bread or cheese, as mushrooms growing on a rotting log or in the lawn, or some other source of food. And the key here is that when the fungi obtain nutrients, they secrete enzymes into the food material surrounding them and digest that food externally and then absorb the nutrients pre-digested. There's no mouth, there's no digestive tract. The nutrients are then transported from one part of the organism to another, not by a circulatory system, but simply by moving cell to cell. So fungi secrete enzymes. They use a strategy of external digestion and then absorption into the organism. Of course, plants use an entirely different structure as autotrophs, or a different strategy rather. Sunlight is used to build carbon dioxide molecules into larger sugar molecules to store energy. Photosynthesis, through a series of complicated steps, turns the energy of light into the energy of food. And so plants make their own food, and then within the cells of the plant itself break that food down using cellular respiration to produce ATP. So plants make food, they don't ingest it, they don't digest it externally and absorb it. What's being absorbed in the roots, though they structurally look similar to the hyphae in fungi, what's happening is water is being absorbed along with a few other trace molecules and atoms that are useful in helping the plant to build tissues and maintain tissues. So very different strategies. But when we get to the animals, represented here by some very simple animal forms, we basically get a multicellular organism, and there is a tube or chamber into which food is absorbed or ingested. So the food is brought wholesale into the body of the organism and then broken down within the organism, not externally, as is the case with the fungi. So here you can see a mouth in the organisms represented. The top, maybe a coral or a jellyfish. They are quite simple as animals go, but still require food and other nutrient materials to be ingested into the body of the animal. When it comes to digestive systems, internal digestive systems, there are two versions. One is incomplete. In an incomplete digestive system, the mouth and the anus are essentially the same opening. In other words, the opening through which food is taken in and the opening through which wastes are eliminated is the same opening. A complete digestive system, as is modeled in the bottom of the diagram, has a separate mouth and anus, and they're usually separated at opposite ends of some sort of tube or system of tubes. In a complete digestive system, food is taken in through the mouth, digestion, absorption takes place within the body, and then excretion or elimination takes place at the anus. So complete versus incomplete digestive systems. The complete digestive system is the more evolutionarily derived. In other words, organisms with incomplete digestive systems evolved first, and later complete digestive systems show up in the fossil record with slightly more complex animals, and then in their descendants. So when you get to a complete digestive system, if we look here at vertebrates, probably the most complex digestive systems of any organisms on the planet, including humans, basically you have a tube, a long tube through which food passes. And the structure and nature of that tube and what's happening with the food at various stations along the way will vary from one group to another. But basically, these tubes have to be very long in order for food taken in large pieces, large chunks. And in the case of a snake or in some birds, for example, their prey is swallowed whole. And so they have to be able to deal with an entire organism within their body and to break it down into its component parts, absorb what they need and get rid of what they don't. So a lot has to happen, and for that reason, digestive tracts are usually quite long. They're quite long, and they're folded into the body of an organism in order to fit more efficiently. For example, the average length of the intestines in humans is somewhere on the order of 26 to 30 feet. So imagine 26 to 30 feet of tubing in your body, folded and wrapped and coiled so that it fits. So if you were to cut the digestive tract out, mouth to anus, it would extend to about 30 feet, sometimes more. And that's a lot of tubing. So a lot can happen along that 30 foot of tubing. And the goal is to understand what processes are taking place in humans. The basic strategy, as is mentioned here, is to run food through this tube to process the food and break it down into the fundamental nutrients that are needed, and then to have an interaction between the digestive tract and the circulatory system so that the food molecules, the nutrients, can be absorbed into the bloodstream and delivered ultimately to every cell of the body. So I think that's an important general concept to keep in mind, is that ultimately what we eat is needed in every single cell of the body, and ultimately its purpose is served during cellular respiration when the molecules, the nutrient molecules from the food we eat are broken down and ATP is produced in the process. And of course, ATP is the energy currency, right? The energy currency by which cells do the things they need to do to survive and to function in the body. All right, so here's an overview of the digestive system. A lot of these organs are familiar to you already, from the mouth to the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestines, large intestines, and finally to the rectum and out of the body in the anus. There are a number of accessory organs shown here as well. There's a nice video overview. I really encourage you to watch that in the slides that I've posted in Canvas. You'll you'll get a view of quite a few processes up close that you're not used to seeing, and they've done some really creative camera work. So just be ready. It's an interesting view of things, but you should definitely check it out. All right, so what's going to happen? The food we eat is going to be broken down into the basic components that we've talked about, the basic biomolecules, which are crucial for cells and are available in the food that we eat. So simple sugars from carbohydrates. Glucose is a great example. Of course, glucose was the sugar featured in cellular respiration as an example, as a prime example of how to turn the energy in food molecules into ATP. But amino acids, of course, for all the proteins we're building, fatty acids, which are the central component of lipids, and nucleic acids, which are going to be useful in synthesizing additional DNA. Keep in mind that when we start our lives as an infant, we might be, 20, 22 inches long, and we eventually grow into much larger individuals. Every single part of us that results in growth is made possible because of the structural components that we derive from the food we eat. So in a very real sense, we are composed of the food that we've eaten. Prior to that, when we first begin our lives as a zygote, a fertilized egg, we go from one cell to many cells and eventually to a fetus and to a newborn baby by way of adding molecules, building cells. And that's made possible entirely by nutrients supplied by the mother in the womb. So we are made out of molecules that we eat after birth, and we are made out of molecules that our mothers eat prior to birth. Pretty amazing to think that life is perpetuated by simply taking molecules from our surroundings and turning them into more living tissues, more living structures. So the initial stages, of course, of digestion take place in the mouth. So here are some images of the primary components that we're used to thinking about and using when we eat. Teeth are central. Teeth are central. If you doubt that, try to eat a meal using only your lips. right? And teeth come in various forms. There are forms that we'll look at on the very next slide, but of course, to the initial separation of bits of food from our surroundings, from food sources in the environment around us, is made possible by the teeth. And this is an important step for mechanical digestion, right? This physical breakdown of food. Teeth are crucial in that process. Here's a look at the types of teeth that we find in the human mouth. Lots of vertebrates have these teeth or modified versions of them. They come in different sizes and shapes depending on the diet of the organism. So here you can see incisors, indicated in the diagram as being the front teeth. So basically the 4 front and 4 bottom teeth, which if you think of eating a carrot, helps to explain exactly what they're for. They're for cutting. Canines, which are not terribly developed in humans, but they're still there. Those are our vampire teeth. Those are for piercing and tearing. So those can be useful. For example, if you have ever enjoyed beef jerky, think about using your incisors and canines together to tear, to rip, to cut. And jerky can be kind of tough, and you want to separate little pieces from the whole in order to make them more digestible. Premolars, tearing and grinding. And then, of course, molars, which are our primary workhorses when it comes to grinding and mashing. So if you imagine eating a slice of pizza, for example, you're going to use all of these teeth. You're going to use all of these teeth to prepare the food for ingestion. And once the food is ingested, to prepare the food for swallowing. So you should know those 4 basic types of teeth and their basic functions. Also in the mouth is saliva. And saliva is generated by cells in a number of glands that are embedded in the tissues surrounding the mouth. Those glands are called salivary glands. And it's not necessary that you know the individual names of each of these glands for this class, but you can see them in the diagram here. What saliva is going to do is primarily moisten the food, the chewed food. So as the teeth mechanically break the food into smaller parts, the saliva will be added to the food particles to moisten it, and will create basically a collection of moist chewed food called a bolus. And the bolus is going to be much easier to swallow than unchewed and unlubricated food, right? But also, the saliva contains some enzymes. There's an enzyme in particular I'd like you to be familiar with called salivary amylase. There's that ending for enzymes, ASE. Salivary amylase is capable of breaking down complex carbohydrates into sugars. And so if you eat a cracker, for example, and chew on it long enough and mix it with enough saliva, the complex carbohydrates present in the starches and other complex carbohydrates present in the cracker will be broken down into simpler sugar called maltose. And in fact, if you leave chewed cracker in your mouth long enough, it will actually begin to taste sweet. I'm not suggesting that you do that. That's a long time to leave a cracker in your mouth and wouldn't be that pleasant. But it is a little experiment you can run so that you can taste the simple sugars being broken down in the mouth. So that's the role of saliva, preparing the food to be swallowed and helping to hold those food particles together in one structure called the bolus, and of course to provide a little bit of breakdown of carbohydrates. Okay. Additionally, saliva is going to alter the pH ever so slightly. It increases the pH. Part of preparing the food for the next round of the digestive process is to begin to combine the food with fluids that will influence the pH. And as we're going to see, the pH environment for the food as it moves through the digestive tract is going to vary from one section of the digestive tract to another. And that pH needs to be carefully controlled because, as you'll remember, every enzyme that functions, whether it's in our bodies or in a beaker, will operate best under a particular set of conditions of temperature and pH. And we explored that in lab. So finally, we see that the saliva does have some few antimicrobial effects. So there's a little bit of antibiotic support that comes from saliva itself. And so there are the functions of saliva. So in the mouth, we've prepared the food by breaking it mechanically into smaller parts, by coating it and grouping it, bringing it together and lubricating it to be swallowed. And there's also a little bit of breakdown of carbohydrates as well. When swallowing when we're ready to swallow, there's a number of steps. Swallowing is a very complex process. It's a very complex process that we take for granted. And there's a lot that can go wrong in a swallow, and that can result in choking. So here in the structure that you see in the diagram, the primary structures that we want to be familiar with would be the tongue, also the pharynx, which is basically the throat, the epiglottis, which is a cartilage-like flap that will move down over the trachea, the windpipe, to prevent food and fluids from entering the windpipe. It's a really interesting way to do to design an organism, to put the structures and tubes through which air passes into the body to make gas exchange possible, very close to the tubes and structures designed to bring food and nutrients into the body. This presents a bit of a problem. It's not a great way to do things. And so what we'll talk a little bit about is the importance of timing, The food is going to be swallowed and enter a tube behind the windpipe or trachea called the esophagus. And so as it passes down over and into the esophagus, it passes right over the opening to the windpipe. And so there is a structure. It's supported by cartilage, which moves down and covers the windpipe, the trachea, as we swallow. Now, if you swallow too quickly, or if you're talking and inhaling or laughing while you chew, then the epiglottis can get stuck open and food can get caught in the top of the trachea. And that, of course, is what choking is. So choking is a fairly dangerous and potentially deadly event. Here are some statistics on choking deaths. Through 2015 to 2020 is what I was able to find. Now, if you put your fingers on your Adam's apple is actually some reinforced cartilage that is helpful in protecting your larynx or your voice box. And when you swallow, you'll notice that the larynx, the Adam's apple, moves upward. And it's hard for me to feel that while I'm talking, but hopefully you can feel that. So the epiglottis then drops. So as the voice box moves up, it closes the epiglottis like a lid. So you think of something like a teapot, right? And the lid will close down over the top surface of the pot, and the epiglottis does the same thing for the trachea. But when there's a breakdown and choking takes place, it can be very dangerous. So in the order of 5,000 deaths a year in the U.S. alone, choking deaths alone. So think about that. We have a design in which eating becomes risky, right? Eating becomes risky, and we need everything to work just right to avoid potentially dangerous situations. All right, so the bolus, this ball of chewed food and the saliva that's holding it together, then moves past the trachea into the esophagus, and swallowing is complete. What's going to happen next is that bolus is going to be moved down the esophagus and into the stomach. And by the way, for this first installment, I'm going to get the food to the stomach and then take a break in the video. I'll upload that section of the video and then probably go stomach through the rest of the digestive system in a second video for this lecture. The muscles surrounding the esophagus are involuntary muscles. So we talked a little bit about the various types of muscle tissue that is present in the human body. We have skeletal muscle, which we sometimes call voluntary muscle. Those would be the muscles you use to exercise, move, walk, run, dance. Those are things that your brain generally controls or can control. So you can tell your right arm to lift. You can tell your left leg to kick, and all the things involved with dancing or running or doing anything that involves coordination will largely involve the skeletal muscle. You're not always thinking about what you're doing with the skeletal muscles, but you can. You can override what your body is doing and say, hey, wait a minute, I'm falling asleep. I'm starting to slouch. Let me sit up quickly so the teacher doesn't notice that I'm falling asleep in class, and that sort of thing. The muscles surrounding the esophagus are involuntary, which means you do not have to think about them. You do not have to consciously think about what happens to this bolus of food after you've swallowed it. You might be aware of where it is. For example, I've had the experience of eating something like a tortilla chip and not chewing it very well, and so it moves into the esophagus. There's sharp bits, and it's dry. It hasn't been incorporated into that slimy bolus, and I can actually feel the point of the chip as it's scraping against the esophagus all the way down. The only good thing about that experience, because it hurts, the only good thing about that experience is it gives you a sense of how slowly the food moves from the pharynx, the throat, down into the stomach. It is not a rushed process. The muscle contractions that make this movement of food possible is called peristalsis. And that's the term we use to describe the movement of food throughout the entire digestive tract. It is involuntary the entire time. You don't have to be aware of where food is in the digestive tract and have your brain tell the digestive tract tissues what to do in order to move it. It simply happens. So it's a bit like squeezing toothpaste out of a tube. It's a little more coordinated and a little bit more complex than that, but that's the idea. Peristalsis. And here's some examples of peristalsis in more detail. You can see there's contraction of muscles surrounding the esophagus above the bolus. There is a relaxing of muscles below the bolus, and the bolus is generally larger than the esophagus. But this is something that happens even when you take a sip of water, though liquids will move more quickly through the esophagus than chewed food will. But it's a very controlled process. It doesn't just, fall through the tube into the stomach. It's a very controlled, slow process. So this peristalsis is really important throughout the entire digestive tract. Here's some animals that I've thought about in terms of their experience drinking and eating. You look at an animal like a giraffe. So giraffes go mouth to esophagus to stomach the same way humans do, an incredibly long esophagus. Giraffes and other fairly long-necked animals like the gazelle you see here, and going back in time to the sauropod dinosaurs, the long-necked dinosaurs, who had exceedingly long necks, sometimes as long as 30 feet. So how do you get material to move through a tube that's 30 feet long, especially if the material, like the water that you see the gazelle and giraffe drinking, is located below the stomach? Well, that's where peristalsis is really important. Peristalsis, in a sense, creates a little miniature chamber for the food and water to rest in, and then slowly changes the location of that chamber by constricting and relaxing muscles. This works so efficiently that you can actually swallow standing on your head. I've tried it. It wasn't something I did on purpose, but when I was doing a headstand, as a kid, one of those where your friend holds your feet up against the wall, I was there long enough to try to swallow. And it wasn't the most pleasant thing in the world, but I actually was able to do it and noticed that it was a bit painful and a bit forced, but still, after swallowing, this saliva did not return to my mouth, which is what I had expected to happen. So I don't know how useful that information is. And again, I'm not encouraging you to try a handstand and to swallow, but if you're ever in that situation, you might give it a try just to remind yourself of the control that the esophagus has. By the way, a term that we're going to run into all throughout the digestive tract is the term sphincter. A sphincter is a ringed muscle, and ringed muscles are located at various points along the digestive tract because they essentially help to cinch the digestive tubes closed. So after you swallow, there's a sphincter that constricts at the base of the pharynx, at the top of the esophagus, to prevent the food from coming back up. As the food arrives at the stomach, there's a sphincter that is separating, creating a separation between the stomach and the lower esophagus that then has to relax and open to allow the food through. So think of sphincters as like valves. Valves, you can also think of them as like the cinch tie on a bag, right? Maybe a sports bag or some other bag that has a cinch tie on it. And they're circular muscles, and they're very important because they prevent digested food from backing up in the digestive tract, and they help to control the delivery of food from one section of the digestive tract to another. And when that sphincter, by the way, it's called the pyloric sphincter, the sphincter that separates the stomach from the lower esophagus, when there's backup of material from the stomach through that sphincter, that's what we experience as heartburn. That's what we sometimes call acid reflux. And we'll get into the fact that in the stomach, the conditions are extremely acidic and the tissues of the esophagus are not suited to protect themselves against it. And so the backflow of material in digestion can be a harmful process. We want to keep everything moving in a nice controlled way all the way through the digestive tract. Well, I'm going to end here for this video at the stomach. We'll start here in the next video, which I probably will get up tomorrow. So today is Tuesday night. I'll get it up by Wednesday evening. And we'll talk about the journey of the food through the digestive tract beginning at the stomach. I do want to at least leave you with a question. If you think about it, what we're eating is plant and animal material, plant and animal tissues. And as that material runs through the digestive tract, it's completely broken down and into its component parts and eventually absorbed. Well, why doesn't the digestive tract digest itself? Right? There's nothing unique about the digestive tract. In fact, you could eat stomach from another animal and digest it without any problems. Well, why didn't that stomach digest itself while it was in the animal? Why don't the various stages of the digestion within our body digest the organs that are helping to make the process possible or in which the process is happening? So that's a question worth thinking about, and I'll leave you with that. Hope you're doing really well. Again, as always, please reach out with any questions or concerns. Look forward to seeing you soon. And I'll be back on video again tomorrow night. Thanks. Bye-bye.